Okay, what we're going to talk about here first is, this is a question that comes up a lot. How do I filter my data based on the user that has logged in? And almost all of our applications, we're logging a user in somewhere through security or whatever. So how can we filter the data from that user to show there's just stuff that pertains to them? So the first question we have to ask is, why do we want to do this? A couple of reasons. We want to show data that's relevant to the user. Sounds kind of obvious, but we'll talk a little bit about what that means. That's relevant to the user. In other words, it belongs to the user, you might say. There's also data that's related to the user that may not belong directly to the user, but the user has information about it, like what office do they belong to, etc. Also, we want to hide data that the user should not see. Now, obviously, with security, we can do some of that, but there's also situations where you don't want to show, for instance, a person, if you're showing invoices, for example, you may not want to show an invoice for another user. Or if you're showing tasks for an office they belong in, you don't want to show tasks for another office. So basically, we're going to look at a few things here. What are we going to filter on? And this is one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is, how do I want to organize my data? So there's data that's specific to an individual user, like orders, tasks they got to do, and so on. There's also the data that's related to the group the user belongs to. You know, a user may belong to an office, they may belong to a department, they may belong to a specific facility. So we can filter on these things if we know this information. So a lot of times when people think filter on user, they think of data that's related directly to that user. But this is data that's related indirectly to that user because they belong to a group and the data belongs to the group. But here's another way we can filter data. You hear a lot of questions from time from multi-tenant operations where we're dealing with multiple companies. And we're not going to get into the details of multi-tenant, but this is using a filtering method is one way we can create it, and it's actually fairly common. If a user belongs to a company, once we know the user, we know their company. And therefore, we can filter everything from that point forward on just that company. So they can't see somebody else's. And this is actually pretty common in a lot of multi-tenant situations. Basically, we can filter on anything that's related to that user, that we can attach to that user. We're not limited just to stuff that's attached directly. We can get a lot of stuff that's attached indirectly. So the very first thing we have to start with, and we're going to do this, is we have to start with our application design. It really starts with your data to begin with. Because one of the things you're looking at is you have to figure out who owns the data. For instance, what identifiers are we going to use? Are we going to use a user identifier, an office identifier, company identifier, etc.? What identifiers do we need to organize our data? We then have to add those identifiers to all the data in each individual record. For example, if we're looking at offices that belong to a company, the office table has to have a company field so we know what company it belongs to. And then we have to establish what information do we need to create these filters. What do we got to get from this user? We have to get, for instance, who they are, their identifier, maybe their office identifier, their department, maybe their company. So we got to decide what information we need. Then we have to link the user security to the user security to the user data. So when we log the user in, we know who the person is that logged in through the security system. How do we get that information and connect it to other user data? And we're going to take a look at that. Then finally, we set up the filters. Now when we do this, a couple things we have to do. When we're actually running the application, the first thing we got to do is we get the user to log in. Once we have the user logged in, we get information about the user, which could be his office, his department, his company, etc. And then typically we're going to save all this in session variables. Now the reason we use session variables is fairly simple. Our traditional login method we recommend is the login is for the length of the session. So once a user logged in, that's the only user in that session. So we put the data in session variables. When the user's session times out, the variables all go away. And we're going to show you if the user logs out, how we can make all the variables go away as well. They only need to be held temporarily. We don't need to store them completely. So let's build one. We'll show you how you build this. Lost my mouse. Okay, the first thing we're going to look at is the data. And I don't know how big this is. We'll take a look here. Oh, you actually can see it. Okay. I wanted to kind of avoid that magnifier fun. Let's take a look here. This is the security table. This is the security users. And if you've looked at any of our web security, some of the data looks very familiar. We have an identifier, and then we have the user ID. This is the visible ID that the person logs in under. This is typically the field we're going to use to link all the data to everything else. And of course, we have other data as well. So we look at this, we can see we have users here. We have an internal users table in this case. This is the table that we're storing a lot of information about each individual user. And if we look over here, we've also saved the security user name in this table as well. So we're going to link this table to the security using this value. And you can see in here we've identified their company. We're using GUIDs here for our unique identifiers for the keys for each value. So we have a company, they belong to an office, they belong to a department. So if the user logs in, we get their username. If we have their username, we can find their record in this table. And then from this table, we can identify their company, their office, their department, and of course, themselves. So we have a lot of information about this user and the data that it relates to. Now we look at other data in here. In this case, we're going to show filtering basically by a number of methods, company, etc. If we look at other tables, for instance, offices, we have multiple companies in this particular database. Actually, we'll look at companies first. And this particular database contains data for two separate companies, but obviously they can't see there's information. So we have an identifier for each one. We have Doe Engineering and Smith Manufacturing. So we look at offices, and if you note in offices, we have the company identifier as well as the office identifier. We need to know what company this office belongs to. We look at departments, same thing. We have company identifiers and we have department identifiers because each company has its own offices, its own departments. If we look at another one here, we have tasks. If you notice, the task is linked to the user. We don't need to link this to the office, or we don't need to link this to the department or the company, because we can get that through the user. If we know what user it is, we know what task belong to that user, and then we know what company they belong to as well. So let's take a look at how we build this thing. First place we need to look at is how we link the user security to the user table. And in this particular case, we're going to show a component. This was actually built from a standard UX template for editing a user and their information. And this is actually built from that. If we take a look at the fields, what we're going to see here is we have a series of fields at the top. We look here. These are all related to the extra user table, the internal users. That has all their information about their offices, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom section down here is all their security information. So how do we link these two together? Well, if we come up here to our property or to our data binding, we look at our data binding, we show how we bound data together. The first thing we notice is everything from here on up is bound to the internal users, with the exception of the office and department. They're just display fields. They're not bound to anything. Or I shouldn't say they're not editable. But we do actually save the office identifier and the department identifier. If we look here from username on down, these are listed as unbound, but they're part of the security system. So as you can see, the username is actually saved in two places. It's saved in the internal table, internal users. It's also going to be saved in security. In fact, if we look at the events, if we look into server-side events, we're going to initialize here. We load the security values, and what we find is the username is linked to security through this, and we also already saw in the data binding how the username is also linked to the users. So once the user logs in, we now can get information from both areas. There's a number of things on here. For example, we have one where this particular form, we may need a master user that can see both companies. Now, obviously, we don't want them to see much information, but they have to set up other users so people can actually get into their company. So in this particular little mini app, there's a master administrator. The only thing they can do is set up companies and set up users in that company. That's all they can do. They can't see anything else. And when they come in, the first thing they have to do is select the company. We'll take a look at this. So if they select the company, it's passed into this component as an argument. So what we find is if they argument is passed in, we find that there is an argument for company. Can everyone see that okay up there? Hopefully the size is good. If the argument was passed in, it has a value. But if it doesn't have a value, what we're going to do is we're going to fill it with a session variable called ID company. And we'll show in a little bit where we got that. So if they got into this form in a way where they passed a company argument in, we know what company it is. On the other hand, if they didn't, we then use the session value from ID company. And we set the company to that. And the rest of this here is pretty standard components. So now that we have a way of getting the user security information linked to the user internal table. Once we have that, we're on our way. So let's take a look at a UX component we're going to use here for logging in. This is a fairly standard UX. We're actually using some of the UX component login capabilities. As you can see, there's not a lot here. We just have a username and a user password. It's an integrated login. And we come around to that, and the first thing we see, we do have a on login event. We scroll down here, what we're going to do here, first thing that happens, if the login succeeds, what we're going to do is we're going to create a bunch of session variables and fill it in with user data. So we create a connection, we create some arguments, we create a select statement. And notice we actually have a number of joins in here because we're getting information about the office, about the department. We're going to get not just the ID values, we're going to get some names so we can use them in different places. Basically, we can pull up any data we want to show about this user. We come down here and we actually are using a SQL table. We're going out and doing a SQL select. And we open it up, we set it as portable. We execute it. And this is a way to find out if the execute returned any rows. Those of you who were in the session yesterday, we discussed this. When you do a SQL select statement, the result set that comes back in does not have focus on any row. So if the first command you make is next row, that means it can move to the first row, which tells you there's a first row. So we have data. If this next row came in and was false, that meant we found nothing. There was no user. We didn't get any results set back, so we keep going. All of our session variables down here are character. So as you can see, we're going to convert some of these. This ID here is actually a unique identifier. But we're going to convert all these to character to store them into session variables. And as you can see, we're filling some in with company name, office name, the user department name, plus all the identifiers. We even brought in the user zip code for some purpose. I'm not sure why. And we actually have one here for user full name, which is basically just for display purposes. So we're not only bringing in data that we can use to filter, we're also bringing in data to display to tell something about the user. Now if here we have a failed login, we aren't able to log in, what we do there is we set all the session variables to a blank. So if the user logs in and their login fails, we wipe out all the values. But where do we start from? I mean, this is okay when they're logging in, but what happens when they first open the application? We still have to know something about it. Well, in this particular application, this UX component is actually held inside of a tabbed UI. We have a tabbed UI here with a whole bunch of field controls in it, different components. This is the UX component at the very top that has the login. All of these have various levels of security. For example, the master administrator, all they see is this UX component. They see company, and they also, I think, see company users. And that's about all they see, because that's all they can get. Everything else is linked to a company login. And if we look at our securities, for example, we can see the types of groups we have. We have an administrator. This is the master administrator. Then we have company administrators, and then we have users. Fairly simple system. Well, if we look at the tabbed UI is the master page. It's the first page that opens. Every time we do a login or a log out, it gets refreshed, which tells me we're reloading that page periodically, which gives us an opportunity to do something. If we look on the on-tabbed initialize event, which is the one that occurs every time we regenerate this tabbed UI, the first thing you'll see in here, we set all the session variables. We just dim them, all is C. And then we come down here and we find out, is anyone logged in? And if no one is logged in, which is the case the first time this loads, we make sure all this is set to blank. In the case of a log out, even though we're logging out on the UX component, it's in the tabbed UI. The tabbed UI will reload, because of the way we've designed this, When the tabbed UI reloads, it hits this section of code, says there's no users logged in anymore, it wipes out all my session variables. So in this way, we're using we have the user and security. We link them to their bigger user table. From that we get data, and then we populate session variables. So with these session variables, we now have data we can use to do some linking. Now the next thing we have to look at is, obviously we have to have data to filter on, which we're going to use company, etc. So let's take a look at the ways we can do that. Let's take a look at user tasks, for example. And here we're going to look at this, and we're going to have, we have an argument. The argument in this case is just the internal user. And if you notice, we're setting it to the session variable. So when we do tasks by user, what are we going to filter it on? We're going to filter it on the user, because we only want that user to see their tasks. So we're going to use that session variable we created. So whenever we look up tasks, we're going to get that particular one. Also, a lot of times we will, in the events, typically on the on-grid execute, a very good practice is we're going to dim this session variable just to make sure it exists, whether it has value or not, just so it exists. Now the situation is going to be is what happens when we save this? We have to now, when we save a new record, we have to identify the user. Well, here we can use some of the other events, and notice what we're doing here. We have data submitted for the internal user. Well, we're not actually adding that in, but what we can do here is in the before validate event, we can actually set the ID for the internal user to our session variable. We filtered on the beginning, so any new record we create or any record we edit is going to have that user ID added right to it, right from the session variable. So we'll come back out here and we'll look at another area. We have tasks by office. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to select an office, and then we're going to find out what tasks are in that office. In other words, all the users that belong to that office, what are their tasks? Well, the first thing we have to do is find, we're actually going to show this a little later. We're going to have an office. We're actually opening up an office. Here we have a UX component with a list. We come up on our list properties, and what we're going to see here is we have a more complex SQL select statement. And down here we have a where clause that we're going to find the users based on the office. Now once we know the office, what else do we know? We also know the company, because an office can only belong to one company. So once we know the office, we can now say, okay, we don't need to worry about the company because it only belongs to one company. So we come up here and we look at arguments, and the argument we need to create is ID office. If you look at ID office, what's it based on? It's based on that session variable we created when the user logged in. So we have the user's office, so we do tasks by office. We know the office the guy belongs to, therefore we can use that for a filter. The other thing too, when we do to go to save some of this information, in this case we're just looking at tasks, we're not actually doing any editing. Let's take a look at, see if we can find the one I'm looking for, tasks by company. Now here we have tasks by company, which means we have to filter by company. So that's one thing, but we also want to find information for a specific office. So we want to show a drop down here that shows all the offices for this company. So obviously we have to filter that by the company. We don't want to show offices for another company. So we come down here to our choices, and we look at our select statement. And what we have done here, if you look at our select statement down here, we have a where clause in here that's filtering on the session variable ID company. And this is something we do a lot of different places. We're doing filtering like this. We're always putting the company ID in here. And since we know the office has a company ID in its data, we can filter by that. And where did we get the ID, the session variable? We got it from the user. When the user logged in, we know his company. We can now show data that's relative to his company. And then we go in and look at our list control, look at tasks. We have a little bit more complex where clause here. And we're going to find it by the office again. And it's basically the same thing. Once we've used the office, we're going to use the office in here. And the difference here in our argument is we're going to get the ID office from the ID office control, which you see here. So we're actually going to get it from the control. So when we select an office, which is filtered by a company, we now know the office. We now can find all the tasks that are related to that office. We can do this in any place where we're looking up values that are unique. For example, we look up the users. Go back to the user one. For instance, here we're looking up the department in the office to fill it in. Now, what we're going to use here on our lookup, if I can find it down here. There we go. We're using an edit combo list. We take a look in here, and we have some filters and so on here. And we have a dynamic filter. And we're making the dynamic filter equal to a field value called ID company. Well, where are we getting that? Well, if we take a look here, one of the things we're doing, remember in the server-side event here in the execute, we were populating an argument called ID company. That argument always has a value. So then we do up in the controls and we look at ID company up here. We have a hidden field here with the company. Notice we have a bunch of hidden fields here that have the identifiers in them. And why do we need to know those identifiers? Because we have to save them for the user. So we look at ID company. We go up here and we look at its default value. It's equal to the argument ID company. So it's a hidden field. So as soon as we open up this record, that company field has the identifier for the company, which means we now can filter on that. So we're filtering based on that information. And let's see, this one doesn't have it. Yeah, here we have one where we're actually adding the user to it when we do the end. Another thing we're going to look at here is here we're looking at offices. We have offices on here. We're filtering them initially to show the offices for this company. But what if we add a new office? Well, we come into our server-side events, and the first thing we do is in these validate records, when we're saving a new office, we're always going to add the company to it. And again, we have it in a session variable. So since it's in a session variable, we can add it. Now, theoretically, we could go in here and add another little if statement here. You know, if session ID company has a value, then we save it. Otherwise, we cancel the whole save. We won't even allow them to save it without a company. And the same thing down here, we're adding the company to it. So you can see what we have here. We log the person in. We get information about the person. We populate session variables. We use those session variables then to filter data. We filter lookups. We filter everything. So the key there is when you want to do all this filtering, where you make sure your data structures will support all of that. That's all it takes to filter users by their filtered data based on logged in user. And we have a couple minutes. We'll show you what happens. Here we have the tabbed UI with the UX component in it. If we log in as the master, see if I get it right. Can't spell. And we log in. We have an error. Why did we get an error? That we shouldn't have gotten that error. We'll try this again. Actually, the user logged in. We forgot to refresh this. This has been up for like an hour or two, so the session variables all went away, which is the problem when you're doing some of these. So now we've logged in by, notice there's no user information up here. And the reason is, we look at a little thing called user information. This says what session information was stored for this user. Well, this is a master user. He doesn't belong to a company. Therefore, when we try to find his company information, what do we find? We find nothing. So we don't fill in any session variables for that person because they have none. So all the session variables are empty for this user. And again, you can see there's no data for him either. And up here you can look at companies, so he can edit companies. This form allows the master administrator to set up companies. And he wants to set up users for the companies. Here we have a drop-down list that allows him to select what company he wants. He selects the company, it then goes find a list of users for that company. And when he goes to edit the new user, he opens up the new user form that we showed earlier, and we've already passed in the company information to this. So when we enter this user, they'll be linked to that company. Let's log in as a different person. Notice our log out here is on the tabbed UI, even though we logged in on a UX. I think there's actually a video out on this right now, how to use a UX component to log in on a tabbed UI and then log out on the tabbed UI. So let's see if we can get in. Whoops. As you can see, we're using a fancy password called password. This is a very bad security thing to use passwords like password or let me in or something like that. They're very easy to guess, but makes it also very easy to remember for a demonstration. So we're going to log in here as, I misspelled John. Well, that just shows that security does work. So we'll spell John Doe and get him right. And now we log this in, we can see John Doe is a member of Doe Engineering. Kind of interesting. We can look at the offices for Doe Engineering. You can see they have a main office, a regional, a satellite. You can see all the departments. Again, we're filtering in these particular ones by the company because we know the user, we know his company. We can see all the users that belong to this company. We can get user tasks for the current user. They're the ones they have to do. We can find tasks for the office. In this case, we're seeing there's some for John Doe and also Jane Doe. We look at his department, and these are all the things. John Doe is the only member of his department, so we see for the department. And we can do tasks by office. So up here we go up and we select an office. This office list is only the offices for this company. So we can go up and we can select some. In this case, nobody in the main office is doing anything. Regional office is busy. They got things to do. We can look at the user information, and notice we have the session variables. These variables I have in this one, these are the values that are saved in session variables, and these are the values saved in the user table, which should be and are identical. And then the user can also go up and edit his user security because we know who he is. And we'll log in as John Smith. He's another person that's in this system. And notice when we log out, we reload the whole tab UI, so all the session variables get wiped out. As you can see, there's no company listed up here anymore. And see if I can spell. And we'll log in as John Smith. Now we see he's a member of Smith Manufacturing. And as you can see, we can go down through all this list, but you'll see all the offices are different, the departments are different, the tasks are different, and everything. So as you can see, we built a little multi-tenant application here, and we spent a grand total of less than half an hour. Anyone have any questions? Yes, sir. We'll make it available, yes. The data is currently in SQL Server 2014, but you can convert it if you need.
How do you hide the buttons before the user's logged in, and how do you hide them when you log out?
Just with security. Simply on the tabbed UI, on the tabbed UI component, we have on the master, every control has security on it, every single one.
How do you refresh the tab UI?
Well, I'd rather not get into that because that's in our video. Actually, what happens is when the UX stores, it actually forces the component that it's in the reload. We have some code on there to do that. That's not actually part of this, but there is a video out there on using a UX component to log in on a tabbed UI. And if you look at that video, it walks right through all that.
How do you suggest handling if there is a standard list of tasks and some only apply to one company?
Well, all I want to do in showing this is how you can sort things by company. You could create a list of tasks by company. As long as those tasks had a company identifier,
Gotcha.
we can sort them. So the key is when you're developing your data, particularly if you want to use this method of multi-tenant, almost everything has to have a company identifier with it. And then when you save it, you have to have an ID field for that company, and you're probably going to have to add it in the server events so that we store that. Yes, sir.
If the office is corporate, they want to be able to access all the offices.
That's in your data design. That's going to be in your data design.
Well, yeah, I'm just wondering how to filter based off of the session variable,
Well,
corporate or not.
basically what you're going to do in a case like that, a question came up is, if you have a corporate that wants to see all the offices, well, that's going to be fairly simple because you're going to bring up a form where they can select an office. that office selection is going to be filtered by company. And then they can look at that. And actually, I think there's, I don't know if I have it on here. Let me see if we can get John Doe in here. So a corporate user could come in, he can probably say, okay, corporate user, he wants to see tasks by office. This effectively, the corporate user can see this. He can now see every office. So we can just hide and show this form if we want.
What are the advantages of using something like that over just multiple statements for each office?
Okay, I don't want to get into multi-tenant. The reason I don't want to get into multi-tenant, there's multiple ways of doing multi-tenant applications. This is just one. We wanted to use this one to show how to filter by users. You can have multiple databases, you can have multiple URLs. But one key to remember, if you're going to do it by the logged in user, before the user logs in, how do you identify his company? Difficult, unless they come in by a distinct URL. And that's the only way you can really tell. Yes, sir, back there.
I think you had a US component where you were putting the company ID in the hidden field.
Yes.
Why did you have to do that? Isn't it available as a software?
It would be available as a session variable as well. But in this case, the reason I put it in the hidden field, in fact, it's this particular form that we're looking at right now. When I wanted to look up the office, where was I going to get the office information? I got it from an argument. I could have populated the argument with a session variable, but in this case, I could actually populate it from a hidden field as well. I just wanted to show that's a possibility. There are more than one ways to get there.
Are you intending to use in some way for the database security, so have different connection when a user logs in?
You can, but you've got to know who, the first question is, if you're, yeah. Yeah, once a person's logged in, there's again, we're getting into multi-tenant questions, and there is many different ways to do multi-tenant. We could easily spend another hour on that, on how to do multi-tenant. This was just aimed to show you there are ways of doing this where you can filter at a much different level than just the user. You can filter at anything that's associated with that user, which can be his company. Yes?
Who's out of the room. I'm sorry if this is a duplicate question, but how long have we got to switch from ulinks to user rights?
You should have done it in version 11.
So at least for a year.
Yeah, and the reason for that is using the user ID. When we move into like IIS and other systems like that, they do not support a ulink type structure. So we've left it in for legacy reasons. We haven't recommended it since version 11. And I think we'll take one more question.
Just a very quick follow-up on that. Is IAS only for text for session variables?
Yes, only text. Thank you, everyone. I hope this clarifies a question that gets asked a lot.